The medbay visit was a decidedly silent and clinical affair. That was to be expected, however, given the extent of my injuries. My restraints were cut off first, followed by a full desuiting, and a head-to-toe scan that did little in the way of inspiring confidence, given how the scanner seemed to meander at a snail's pace. How long is this going to take? With current configuration and presets, exactly 47 minutes and 15 seconds. The automated voice spoke. It was clearly synthesized and emotionless in its delivery. Perhaps programmed to do so as a subtle means of delineating between true and run-of-the-mill AI. Is this typical of a human checkup? Negative. Is it because of my alien physiology? Negative. Is it because Veer changed the presets? Affirmative. I forced out a hushed sigh as I simply allowed the machine to continue. Superficial wounds were tended to almost immediately. Strange white and gray salves were applied, promptly wrapped in bandages and then held tight with an unknown adhesive. This was quickly followed by a correction of my dislocated wrist and shoulder, as a sharp piercing bolt of electricity shot through my entire arm, forcing me to cry out in pain, but to eventually sigh in relief, as I knew that meant no lasting nerve damage had been incurred. A few broken ribs and a hairline fracture was likewise detected, which required me to remain in bed for a few hours as the miracle machines continued to hum around me, performing whatever medical wonders the humans had on demand. So, the CT and MRI scans came up with nothing, at least as far as the latest edition of the AutoDoc can figure out. Veer finally came forward, after what was in effect hours of thorough medical work. I thought you were joking about these scans. No, I was not. The AI cut me off decisively. His tone had shifted drastically. A severity ran throughout it, even as it echoed through the empty medical bay. Your health and safety is of utmost importance to me, and that so-called joke set off more alarm bells in my head than that sickly massive tumor in that freighter ever did. The disembodied voice continued, in a way that felt more genuine, more down-to-earth and frank than even most of my interactions with my fellow Venerans. There was a humanity in that voice that echoed throughout. I still hadn't gotten used to these interactions. The idea of talking to a being that wasn't bound to a body wasn't just otherworldly, it was downright bizarre. Yet, instead of that otherworldliness being reflected in its voice, in its speech, it instead offered the exact opposite. Warmth, care, yet conflict and frustration all emanated from those few words. A complex yet flawed individual was behind that voice, not just a machine. Veer, I'm sorry for worrying you. I managed out in a half-guilty, half-hushed breath as the AI once again responded, this time after yet another painful pause. It's all right. I understand that organics sometimes utilize humor as a coping mechanism for trauma and mental anguish. I apologize for being so terse with you. It's just, my thoughts and feelings have been difficult to deal with lately. Many of them are permutations of my predictive analytical software, and I have trouble controlling them. The longer I run on this ship's computers, the more these predictive analytics permeate into my sense of self. It inevitably results in overthinking, so to speak. And in that brief 10-second exchange in the hangar alone in my mind had invariably run a total of 971 different outcomes, out of 1,298 where you were no longer yourself, or ceased to be. Veer paused. The speaker systems cutting out for a brief second, as he returned with what could only be described as a static, shaky voice, leaving me alone without an organic partner. Veer, I managed out quietly. It's all right, really. I just need to get used to this whole setup. I'm still myself, don't worry. It's just a bit difficult trying to juggle all of this. The AI began to flicker the lights in the medbay on and off in rapid succession, opening and closing doors, increasing and decreasing noises with the HVAC systems, all in a clear attempt to illustrate his point. Again, I'm sorry for being so terse before. That was uncalled for. I sat in silence for a few hours after that exchange, long into the healing process, and quite a while after the machines had done whatever it is they were doing. The small bit of physical therapy that followed more or less reinforced the fact that I was well and completely healed up, with little in the way of lasting physical damage, aside from a few notable scars on my neck where the false Venerant's claws had dug in. Cosmetic treatment is available to fully remove any and all scars present. Would you like to proceed? The AutoDoc spoke simply, prompting me to simply shoo it away as I stood up and left the room. That won't be necessary. I quickly reaffirmed my decision. It didn't sit quite right with me to remove all signs of that encounter. I needed something from it. Something to remember it by. Something to remind me where foolhardy decisions could lead. On the bridge. One thing remained on my mind as I marched towards the bridge. A single throwaway line that Veer had mentioned that now gnawed at me. The sickly mess of a tumor. The very mental image of that on a freighter, no less, sent shivers down my spine. It must have been meant in jest, or spoken as some sort of strange figure of speech, right? Upon entering the bridge, it was clear Veer hadn't bothered with preparing his robot platform. The room was empty, and despite my understanding that there was indeed someone else present, indeed that there was always someone else present on this ship with me at any given time, it still didn't make things any easier. Veer perhaps picked up on this, as a holographic projection of his former robot body manifested itself before me, just adjacent to the tactical table that I'd parked myself at. "You feeling better, Veer?" I inquired, eliciting that same facsimile of a human expression that proudly displayed a simplified smile on his visor of a face. "Yes, thank you for asking. Though in all honesty, it should be me posing you that question." A cheeky smile formed on the edges of his visor as I quickly took a seat at one of the many chairs around the table. "Right, Veer. I think it's time to finally wrap up what we know about the whole situation. Starting off with what exactly you meant by the sickly mess of a tumor within the freighter?" "Ah, yes. So, I guess I'll go first then. As soon as you left on your little rescue mission," the AI began, craning his head back at me as if to gauge my reaction at that jab, to which I could only shrug in response. I jumped just in time to engage the freighter. Upon scanning and detecting Veneran lifeforms on board, I opted to disable the vessel instead of outright destroying it, given the fact that, well, I was worried what your reaction would be if I killed them outright. The reality of the situation had begun to truly sink in now. My brash order, my jumping to conclusions, did it cost the lives of even more Venarans? Were they the same mind-controlled mess that was that female Veneran? Or were they normal? They couldn't have been, though, given the fact that the female Veneran explicitly stated that I was the only untouched one, for whatever that was worth. "Lasara?" Veer snapped me out of my reverie, as I simply nodded in understanding. I'm fine. Continue." "Alright, so, in addition to that, I detected 2 distinct interloper lifeforms on board. That was what I figured out within the first few scans. Now, as I continued to dig deeper, I began noticing something peculiar. The whole middle part of the ship where the cargo hold's supposed to go? All 525,000 cubic meters of it? It wasn't there. The basic shape was there, sure, but it was filled by this organic mass. Here, it'll be easier if I show you." The table in front of us shifted to a deep blue hue, as a holographic projection of the recently destroyed freighter was pulled up. Cross-sections of it soon followed, and my eyes grew wide at what I saw. Veer was right. The entire volume of the ship's free and open spaces traditionally meant for cargo was simply filled up by this organic mass. It was a solid, cohesive mass as well, one that didn't translate well into scans. If only I had a giant medical scanner, I could have dug deep into that thing. But traditional ship scanners were specifically designed to map out metal, composites, exotic materials even, but not flesh. So yeah, that's what I found. Oh, and another thing. I did detect a latent background radio signature emanating from the ship. Now, the weird thing is that when I shot off its engines, I purposely tore off its radio array as well, knocking out any chance it had to access subspace or local comms, let alone broadcast anything. Now, that should have been the end of it, but there was this latent background radio signature that still remained. I tried translating it, tried parsing it, tried running it through every decoder I knew of, but nothing worked. It was just garbage, gibberish, plain old nonsense. It was clear from Veer's tone that there was some level of enthusiasm in his voice, if not out of plain old morbid curiosity, then something that reminded me of an explorer's or a scientist's streak even. I could definitely get behind that, even if the subject was unsettling to say the very least. Yet one thing stood out to me above all else, a finding that redefined the whole narrative as I leaned in close towards the holoprojector. "Were you able to narrow down the source of the signal at least?" "Yeah, the point of origin is smack dab in the middle of that organic mass." I closed my eyes as I nodded silently, taking a moment to sigh before continuing. "I don't think I need to tell you what I'm hypothesizing here, Veer." The AI's visor shifted to that of a questioning expression. "If you're referring to the hypothesis that the ship and the organic mass were somehow, and in some way, connected to your Veneran friend, yes, I did make the connection. Milliseconds after the ship's destruction, and right as the last few pulses of the signal dissipated, the Veneran lost consciousness. However, I don't think I need to remind you of all people that correlation does not always equal causation. And even though the evidence we have so far is compelling, it's anecdotal, and without any hard data, I can neither confirm nor deny this hypothesis just yet." I felt like I was back in the Academy's science wing, or perhaps even standing before the Council of Elders as a thesis defense again. "Then I think it's time you heard my end of the story." The AI nodded. Its visor now displayed a more intent, thoughtful expression as it began retelling my version of the events. We went back and forth for a good chunk of an hour, cross-referencing the video logs with my accounts. Veer would pause every so often to check up with me, once again as if to gauge my mental fortitude, given how I was quite literally recounting the rather traumatic encounter that had occurred just hours ago. We were actually running well into the evening now, but that didn't stop us. Not that it would have bothered Veer in the slightest. So this leads me to my major point. The exchange we had in the cockpit during our transit back to the ship. I spoke as the shuttle security recording continued. "Isn't that obvious, Untouched One? I'm a Veneran." "There, Untouched One. Keep listening, and you'll see it elaborate on this. We've always assumed that there was some brothers and sisters that evaded the true awakening. We've always assumed that the humans must have had some part in meddling in our affairs. There was always this myth, this legend, this idea that humans could have possibly modified us to such an extent that we no longer had the Vark to hear the songs of the voice. It was always just a myth. Until you, of course. Right, so, we needed to unpack this. Let's start off with the obvious. This thing's singling me out, delineating me from what I can only assume is their version of Veneran, in whatever twisted reality we now reside in. Now, I don't want to throw conspiracy theories around here, Veer, but this false Veneran is maintaining the fact that I'm in some way resistant to whatever forces are controlling it. Now, let's just gloss over that for now, because that entire conspiracy relies on the very notion that there is indeed something out there controlling it. So let's continue. Oh, how the humans must have mangled you, brother. Yes, I'm referring to your Vark, a sensory organ, long hidden, long dormant in our kind, long forgotten, waiting, sleeping, until the day we heard the voice. All of this can and will be explained after we take your mothership and bring you before the old ones. There, that, I practically shouted out. It's referring to a sensory organ that exists that is able to detect whatever this voice is. It's just my standing hypothesis that the voice is whatever background radio signature you detected from the freighter, and given the fact that it referred to a literal organ, it's something that we can objectively find out from a thorough dissection of the false Veneran's corpse. Veer finished my thoughts. Our thought process is practically sinking in a satisfying display of scientific deduction. I couldn't describe it, but felt an overwhelming sense of camaraderie blanket the both of us as we stared into each other's eyes, even nodding in sync as I confidently replied, "Precisely. All right then, I'm transferring the body out of storage into the lab." "We have a lab?" "About that. The ship's configuration is strangely versatile. This certainly isn't your run-of-the-mill cargo runner. I'm genuinely starting to form my own conspiracies as to why this ship was even docked to your asteroid in the first place, given how it should have just been another run-of-the-mill cargo runner. But again, that's a mystery for another day. Right now I'll run some scans on the Veneran, maybe dissect it." Veer paused, his overexcitable streak of euphoric monologuing stopping in its tracks at the latter statement. His expression shifted to that of concern once more as he resumed, lowering his tone somewhat. "That is, if you'll be okay with that." I nodded once in response. There wasn't anything else that needed to be said about my feelings on that thing, but given how Veer was still conflicted on the matter, I decided to air it out anyways. "Veer, just so you know, the way I see it right now, that thing, that beast that calls itself a Veneran, is anything but. The fact that it even acknowledges that it's distinct from what I am, that's reason enough to assume it's not Veneran. This mystery organ on its own will prove just that. And if it doesn't, if we go through with this, and we find out that it isn't any different from you," he retorted uneasily, which prompted yet another layer of anxiety to be added on top of this entire mess. One that felt like a punch to the gut, but one that I had to ignore for now. Nothing was certain until the results came out. "Then we'll at least lay to rest one mystery in this whole affair," I stated firmly. The next few hours were a decidedly stressful affair. I'd spent the better half of it slowly snacking on a dinner that was carefully put together by whatever on-board analog there was to a chef, but I'd barely managed to register the taste or flavor given what was slowly unraveling in the background. I was gambling with my own moral character. For if the Veneran proved to be normal, then that meant I would have sentenced a whole ship of fellow Venarans to death. Flashes and images of my life, of my family, of a time long since past flashed before my eyes. Images of home, of a vibrant manicured lawn set in the middle of an open patio with sounds of children and the elderly alike. A gentle villa, fit for a family of my station, but nothing more and nothing less. My elders who glared at me as I walked past, and my own parents who could only avert their gaze as I left with my head held high, as I left wearing not the ceremonial gowns of a noble, but the well-kept and sharp uniform of a military-sanctioned academic. It was my last memory of them, for elders know how long, and it all came to a head as I turned around to face my family patriarch, glaring at me with intent. "Lasara! Lasara, wake up! I have the results!" The elderly voice was suddenly interrupted by the youthful, androgynous, synthesized voice belonging to Veer. I composed myself, straightening my jumpsuit as I grabbed the datapad to review what data there was to dissect. I'll give you the clip notes. I found the organ in question, and cross-checked its anomalous properties. It seems more sensitive to those anomalous radio signatures than even my own sensors, but I'm still working on the specifics of that. Look, it's located right at the base of the brainstem. Veer highlighted the scan, juxtaposing it to my own. Comparing it to your scans, it's clear you don't have it. However, what? According to some of the older Veneran medical texts I scrounged up from the ship's encyclopedic records, you're supposed to have it. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. Everything I used is in the description below. If there's a story you'd like to hear narrated, let me know and I'll reach out to the author and see if we can make that happen. Thanks again. It's a scary world out there. But remember, to be brave and look up, to seek the stars.